Why some fortunes are designed to look unreal. At first glance, it feels impossible. Numbers so large they seem fictional. Lifestyles that appear detached from reality itself. Yet these fortunes are not accidents. They are engineered to feel unbelievable, and that design serves a purpose. In today's world, visibility is unavoidable. Wealth is tracked, ranked, compared, and analyzed instantly. But among elite sheiks, exaggeration became strategy. To understand why, we need to revisit perception. For centuries, power relied on credibility. If wealth looked attainable, it invited challenge. If it looked limitless, it discouraged resistance. Modern finance amplified this effect. Digital numbers replaced physical assets. Fortunes expanded beyond comprehension, and scale itself became a psychological weapon. When wealth feels unreal, it stops being audited emotionally. People stop asking how. They start assuming inevitability. This is where design enters. Assets are spread across layers. Holdings are abstracted through entities. Valuations fluctuate intentionally. The goal is not clarity. It is intimidation through complexity. When observers cannot understand scale, they disengage from questioning it. At first, this looked like excess. Gold-plated cars, private islands, record-breaking purchases. But beneath the spectacle was calibration. Each display stretched perception further. What seemed absurd yesterday became expected tomorrow, and expectation is control. By making fortunes feel unreal, they became untouchable in the public mind. But this illusion carried risk, because when something feels too large to be real, people eventually try to prove it. And that curiosity would soon test how strong perception truly was. As the numbers grew, skepticism followed. Auditors questioned valuations. Analysts dissected balance sheets. Observers searched for limits. But limits were never the point. The structure was layered intentionally. Public assets anchored credibility. Private holdings blurred scale. Sovereign influence distorted comparison. Each layer fed the illusion. When one valuation was challenged, another replaced it seamlessly. Complexity absorbed scrutiny. This was not deception. It was misdirection. By spreading wealth across systems, no single metric could define it. No headline could summarize it. No audit could capture it fully. And uncertainty protected everything. The unreal scale created psychological distance. Critics disengaged, assuming influence beyond reach. Regulators hesitated, unsure where authority ended. Competitors recalculated ambition. Perception became a moat. Internally, discipline mattered more than display. Excess was controlled, not emotional. Every purchase reinforced narrative. Every headline extended disbelief. Yet behind closed doors, restraint governed decisions. Liquidity mattered more than spectacle. Control mattered more than admiration. The unreal was carefully balanced. Enough visibility to intimidate, enough opacity to protect. But illusion attracts pressure. As global transparency increased, questions grew louder, data leaked, comparisons sharpened. The unreal now faced a challenge. Could perception survive verification? Because once the world starts measuring, even illusions must respond. And that moment of tension was approaching fast. The pressure arrived quietly, then all at once. New regulations tightened disclosure. Data analytics grew sharper. Transparency became unavoidable. What once felt immeasurable began facing measurement. Analysts no longer compared numbers. They compared structures, ownership webs, control pathways. The illusion was not collapsing, but it was being examined. This created friction. Some assets were intentionally de-emphasized. Others were repositioned. Visibility shifted without explanation. To outsiders, it looked chaotic. But inside, it was recalibration. Because the goal was never to defend the illusion. It was to stay ahead of its exposure. When attention peaked, movement slowed. When scrutiny intensified, focus diversified. Perception adjusted before pressure could settle. This is where most misunderstand the strategy. They assume exaggeration requires constant reinforcement. In reality, it requires timing. Too much visibility invites disbelief. Too Little invites curiosity. The balance is narrow. And then came the inflection point, a moment when verification threatened to replace perception entirely. This was the risk. If the unreal became quantified, it would lose its psychological advantage. It would become comparable, challengeable. That could not be allowed. So the strategy evolved again. Fortune stopped being framed as numbers. They became framed as influence, access, reach. The narrative shifted away from valuation toward inevitability. And inevitability does not require proof. This transition set the stage for the final revelation, because when wealth stops needing belief, it enters its most powerful form. The climax was not a defense of numbers. It was a withdrawal from them. When measurement threatened illusion, the frame changed entirely. Fortunes were no longer discussed in totals. They were expressed through reach, through partnerships that reshaped markets, through decisions that redirected capital flows. This was the pivot. By abandoning valuation as a reference point, wealth escaped comparison. You cannot audit inevitability. You cannot challenge momentum. The unreal stopped needing belief. It became assumed. Influence replaced arithmetic. Presence replaced proof. Control replaced explanation. That was the revelation. The illusion was never about excess. It was about discouraging opposition. When scale feels untouchable, resistance feels pointless. Luxury, in this form, becomes psychological architecture. It shapes behavior before action is required. It removes friction before conflict begins. The resolution is subtle but profound. The most powerful fortunes are not those that can be counted. They are those that redefine what counting means. In today's world, visibility is unavoidable, but interpretation is optional. Those who design perception do not chase belief. They replace it with inevitability. And that is why some fortunes feel unreal. Not because they are exaggerated, but because they were never meant to be understood. What made this architecture so effective was that it operated on the psychology of comparison. Most people assess wealth by placing it on a scale they can imagine. 1 million feels significant. 1 billion strains comprehension. Beyond that, the mind reaches a limit. Numbers stop representing reality and start functioning as abstract symbols. The designer of perception understood this limit and used it deliberately. By pushing scale past the threshold of imagination, these fortunes remove themselves from the category of things that could be envied. Envy requires proximity. It requires a gap the observer can imagine closing. When the gap is infinite, envy collapses into something else entirely. Awe, acceptance, indifference. None of those states produce resistance. All of them serve the interests of the wealthy. This was the psychological calculation behind every extravagant purchase, every record-breaking acquisition, every deliberately excessive display. Not pleasure, not status signaling in the conventional sense. Strategic recalibration of what others believed was possible. Once the new ceiling was set, the previous absurdity became the new baseline, and the protection that came with that was worth far more than the assets deployed to achieve it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The transition from numbers to influence also revealed something important about the evolution of power itself. In earlier eras, power was territorial. You could measure by land, by armies, by the number of people whose labor you commanded. All of those were countable. And because they were countable, they were contestable. Wealth shifted toward abstraction deliberately. Financial instruments, corporate structures, sovereign funds operating across multiple jurisdictions. Each layer of abstraction added another layer of protection, not just from taxation or regulation, though those benefits were real, from the possibility of being understood, clearly enough to be challenged effectively. The illusion was therefore not a luxury add-on to an otherwise conventional accumulation strategy. It was structurally integral. The psychological inaccessibility of the fortune was continuous with its financial structure. Both were designed around the same principle, that what cannot be grasped, cannot be threatened, and so the displays of excess were not departures from discipline. They were expressions of it, carefully chosen, precisely timed, calibrated to produce the specific psychological effect that would extend the protection they required. The fortune that looks unreal is the fortune that has done its job correctly. It has made itself too large to audit emotionally, too complex to summarize accurately, too inevitable to resist practically, and in doing so, it has secured something that no amount of conventional security could provide: the disengagement of the people who might otherwise have tried to understand it. Why